Well, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you also on behalf of Christian Borgemeister and all other colleagues of CEF to this session, which opens the board meeting of the Center for Development Research of 2019. Special welcome to our board chair, Mohamed Hassan, and our board members who have already, some of them have arrived, and they will for sure make this a lively meeting. Ernest Aryeetey, a distinguished member of our board, has a long track record of academic excellence. He also is a science policy manager. Ernest got his PhD from Germany in engineering, Ernest, at University of Dortmund. So you are from the Rhinelands. And thank you for your commitment to CEF. Ernest studied at Kumasi. He was Vice Chancellor of the University of Legon, Ghana University. He roamed around in the world. He was at Cornell. He was at Yale teaching. And after you retired from Vice Chancellorship, you continued to produce excellent research. An important book with Ravi Kanbur is The Economy of Ghana, 60 years after independence, an Oxford University Press book, which all students in this room, it's obligatory reading, even if you are not from Ghana. There are several from Ghana here. Ernest also connected to international partner institutes, on the board of UNU WIDER, on the board of UNU. So these are sister institutions. And most importantly for today, please, colleagues, start remembering the acronym ARUA. Sounds more like Hawaii. ARUA, the African Research Universities Alliance. Ernest, I believe you will talk a little bit about the alliance. And what it does. It is a collection of research universities. I could go on to say more about Ernest, that he is a mentor to students, that he is a chair of a bank, and things like that. You can pick that up from the internet. Ernest, we look forward to your presentation, and you permit us questions thereafter. Please take the floor. Warm welcome to Ernest Aryeetey.
Thank you very, very much for this invitation to speak on the issue of higher education in Africa. It's something that I have been involved with for the past 3 decades, so I'm quite very passionate about various changes and developments that have taken place in there. The main message for my talk this afternoon is basically to give out the understanding that Africa is capable of developing globally competitive universities. Africa has so many different development challenges, and to solve them will require the infusion of new knowledge. And Africa has universities that could, under the right circumstances, lead the charge. But a number of prerequisites have to be met as soon as possible. The first being a recognition of the fact that we've got to use the appropriately use new technologies, both in the teaching, learning, the research area. And the way we engage with students has to change. the way we govern our universities has to change. So I'll give examples of how such change already is beginning in parts of the region and what can be done to support this. So talking about technology, the first point I make is the fact that around the world, whether it's in Europe, North America, Asia, everywhere, we've seen various changes in the way higher education is organized. And most of those changes are the consequences of globalization. And for universities especially, is what we call the internationalization of our programs, and the way technology has made most of that possible. So the interaction between learners and teachers has changed significantly around the world. And today also, as a result of being able to move around freely, we are able to gather best practices from different parts of the world, and these things have tended to strengthen universities around the world. So Bonn is a very good example of that. Technology has become central to the process of teaching and learning. The material that is available to students today is much different from what was available 30 years ago. Largely as a result of technology, the internet has made it easier for us to do things that we couldn't have done before. Of course, technology is also driving wider access to education and training. It's possible to sit in Africa and take courses at MIT. Our access to education is not confined to only what you can get at the local university or local institutions. So the technology and research is also one big thing that we need to talk about. These innovations, such as digital curation, preservation, big data, and analytics, and open access to peer-reviewed material, these are things that have all of a sudden made new research possible. Research that 30 years ago, if you tried in Africa, would take you several months or years to complete. Today, it's a lot easier to do. Finding data, I'm an economist, finding data to do economic research, development economics research, it's a lot easier as a result of the technology that's available for gathering the data, the ability to use national data, and so on. 20 years ago, it was almost impossible to look at quarterly data for most of Africa. Today, whether it's GDP, whatever, we're able to generate quarterly data for many things. So as a result of improvements in technology, we've seen how much easier it has become to do good research than it was 2-3 decades ago. We talk about digital technology and how it has made it easier to gather the data. I used to run a research institute, ISA, which works closely with ZEF. We used to spend lots and lots of time in the field doing household surveys. They were very tedious. We used very hefty questionnaires that were extremely difficult to administer. And sometimes the quality of the data that you brought for the field was questionable, largely because the young men and women gathering the data would always find ways of making life easier for themselves. Today, as a result of the technology that has improved, using iPads and laptops, and so in real time, as long as there's Wi-Fi access in real time, you're able to upload material at the center, which allows you to easily follow what is going on in the field. So doing data gathering has become a lot easier than it used to be the case. Now, what does this, so technology is changing. The world is changing. Everywhere in the world, we've seen significant improvements in the way higher education is organized. What about the African universities? Are they in a position to generate, transfer, and apply new knowledge that can be used to solve the contemporary problems of Africa? We are familiar with the Ebola pandemic, the crisis that a couple of years ago was very much wiping out economies in West Africa. Today, doing a similar thing in the DR Congo and possibly other places. Are African universities in a position to do the kind of research that will inform decisions taken by governments and so on? Are the universities preserving knowledge for future use? We all talk about climate change and the need to do something about it. Are we doing the kind of research that will provide solutions to governments? And so these are things that we need to ask about African governments and African universities. Are they doing things that are considered relevant? In many countries in Africa, people think what the universities do is irrelevant to the needs of the people. So I have this map here that shows the global generation of scientific material, published material mainly. It shows you that Africa is really marginal to that process. Africa does not play any significant role. Currently, only less than 1%, well, it was 1% for a long time, we got over 1% in terms of the global generation of new knowledge publications in peer-reviewed journals and so on. How do you change that? How do you change that situation if you want to be relevant to the solution of problems in your country? How do you change that? So what are the challenges that the universities face? There are the issues of relevance. One of the things I got asked all the time when I was vice chancellor was, why do you run programs in philosophy and classics and so on, history? Who needs that in this changing modern world? You know, and I used to respond that any decent university in the world must do philosophy. Of course, there are many good reasons why universities do the things that they do. But there'll be always questions about the relevance of what they are doing. Today, there's a very large number of people who go to African universities and leave and not find work within 2-3 years of graduation. In the past, there used to be people with degrees in the social sciences and the arts. Today, you can take a degree in pharmacy, can take a degree in nursing, can take a degree in architecture, civil engineering, and still not find a job in many African countries, not simply 1 or 2 countries, in many African countries. Why is that the case? Because the structure of the economy is not changing much. So the capacity of the economy to absorb people has been compromised in many significant ways. So even though those economies need the doctors, they need the pharmacists, they need the nurses, they can't provide easy employment for them. For many, many years in Ghana, everybody who took a degree in nursing automatically got employed by the state. Today, the state can no longer afford it. And because they can't afford it, there are people who take degrees in nursing, and there are hospitals that are crying for nurses, but the private sector has not learned how to employ nurses. And that's why there's a huge unemployment among nurses. So how do you fix those kinds of problems? Is it the fault of the universities or is it the fault of the system? One has to find a solution to that. Another change that has taken place, universities no longer have any monopoly over higher education. My university was established in 1948. It was the only university in Ghana, only one of 2 in West Africa. So we had a monopoly over higher education in the system. Today, in Ghana, there are over 10 public universities and over 70 private universities. Apart from these, you also have a situation where governments all over the region are turning various other institutions into universities. And then you have them competing with universities in North America and Europe and so on. As a result of MOOCs, for example, there are many people in developing countries that are able to access higher education elsewhere. So that's a huge source of competition for the African university. How does it deal with it? Then we talk about the situation of women, the fact that women are not getting good access to higher education in many countries is something that needs to be talked about and dealt with. Of course, funding for higher education is dropping in many countries throughout the region. The brain drain ensures that many of the young men and women that are sent out to go and pursue graduate programs and so on may never come back. And even if they do come back, by the time they get back, it's very difficult to integrate them into the system. ICT utilization in many African universities is still very low. Aging faculty. In your average medical school in the region, most of the professors will be aged over 65. In the last few years, the last decade, we've seen a return of many new younger faculty. Many of them will be around between ages 30 and 35. The problem in that medical school, therefore, is that the gap between the 65-year-old and the 35-year-old, that huge gap there, there are hardly any people there to fill. when these 65-year-old guys retire in the next few years, it will be very, very difficult to find good researchers and good professors that will do the high-level work that is needed. So there's a big problem over there that we don't talk about much. Infrastructure in decay in most African universities. That's something I talk about. Now, I present the issue of the challenges that these universities face. I present the issue of what they are required to do in terms of fixing the economies, in terms of fixing the various development challenges of those economies. And then we argue that until they begin to do more and more research that is relevant to the development, nothing is going to happen. So, of course, when you say that Africa needs research universities, people ask, does Africa really need them? A research university is a very, very expensive undertaking. A research university is different from other universities in the sense that in order to produce more of the graduates required, in order to do more extensive research, there's a huge investment that needs to be made in there. In Germany, there are a number of universities that are classified as research universities. In your typical European country, there'll be about 4 or 5 that are classified as research universities, where the state and other units invest a lot more than they would in other universities. So does Africa need these high capital-intensive universities? We argue that yes, they do. They do largely because the problems that are found in those economies require these universities with a lot of investment in research being able to help solve them. Whether it's in Germany or other parts of the European Union, there's enough evidence of strong correlation between the research output and the performance of the economy. There's a lot of evidence about that. For the OECD countries, which produce the work of Ntuli and others, that shows the causality in the relation between output of research and economic growth. So we've seen that in countries that are doing well, in terms of the economy, in terms of politics, governance, and so on, there's a strong contribution from universities and similar bodies. How do we translate this into Africa? Of course, we do ask the question, as I said earlier, what Africa needs. And we believe that, and we've said it several times, that until African countries begin to pay attention to how to generate new knowledge, how to use that new knowledge, apply it in the way decisions are made by governments and so on, the likelihood of attaining the SDGs is extremely low. So if you take whether it's in the area of water, in energy, health, education, and so on, the only way you're going to make any impact in terms of the SDGs is to transform aspects of the economy, improve significantly the efficiency with which goods are produced or services are delivered, the effectiveness of these, and that calls for a very strong, good use of new technology. And even if that technology was made available globally from China, from Japan, from Germany, elsewhere, you've got to find ways of adapting it to the local environment, and that calls for research. So the need to grow significantly the amount of research being done cannot be denied at all in any of these countries. What is the potential? Of course, people argue that yes, because it's expensive to develop these universities, Africa should not pay too much attention to that. And then, of course, we look at the global rankings of universities. There are only 2 African universities in the top 200 in the Times Higher Education rankings. So if you have only 2, for a long time there was only 1 UCT. Now there are 2, UCT and WITS. So if you have only 2, what's the likelihood that you'll be able to generate these? And so, of course, a lot of reasons have been given as to why Africa should focus more on undergraduate universities and so on. We don't buy that argument largely because the challenges that are faced in these economies are huge and that require very significant attention to research and graduate training. That's why we think there's a potential for establishing research universities in the region. So I go to what I call some positive developments. A number of universities have come together and are beginning to take these challenges on in a very concerted manner. One of the things that I argue that is making this possible is the role of leadership. Leadership counts. Leadership is important. So leaders of universities have to see that there's a problem, that their universities are slowly being marginalized in the making of decisions about health, decisions about education, decisions about other development issues, that their universities are no longer a part of that process. The use of consultants, for example, in many economies in the region is huge. And many of these consultants very seldom rely on a collaboration with universities and so on. So there are 16 universities that have come together to form the African Research University Alliance. The idea here is to work together. That is the whole principle, working together in a collaboration. The argument is that even if you took the very best African universities, so largely from South Africa and a couple of them from Egypt, if you took even the best universities, the likelihood that they will be able to make any dent on the problem is very, very low. It's very, very low. The likelihood that they'll be able to do the kind of research that is required for the whole region is extremely low, even for their own countries. But if you brought them together and they were able to share resources, they will make a much bigger impact. That's the philosophy behind this whole network, the philosophy of working together. A good example that I often give is Rhodes University in South Africa. It's a very small university, 3,000 students. And yet Rhodes has invested through support from the South African government massively in new equipment for the sciences, largely located in the chemistry department. There's no way researchers from Rhodes are going to be able to use meaningfully and efficiently the equipment, every modern equipment that you expect to find in a decent science lab, you will find at Rhodes. So how best to make the equipment pay for itself? By opening the doors of Rhodes to other African researchers from Ghana, from Kenya, from Sudan, wherever, to come and be there. So sharing resources. In most African universities, PhD programs have been grinding to a halt and are of no use to anybody. And one of the reasons why PhD programs have suffered that way is because of poor supervision. Can you have students in Ghana who have supervisors in South Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, so on? That's the philosophy here. So you don't deny people access to PhD training simply because there are not enough professors to supervise them, but as a result of collaboration. Similarly, there are students at places like Wits or Pretoria who are anxious to do work that is of interest to the rest of Africa, but can't find good supervisors. Whereas in those same areas, there are people in Kenya, in Makerere, and so on, that can easily supervise these students. And as a result of the exchange that we are talking about, make it easier for them collectively to produce more PhD graduates. So that's the kind of thing that we are talking about here. So this network has decided to settle on 4 pillars for the work. The research, enhanced research, and then graduate training, research management, and research advocacy. Earlier when I showed the map that reflected the global generation of new knowledge, I talked about how Africa was doing less than 1%. The goal of ARUA is to ensure that within a decade, we move from less than 1% to at least 10%. For many, it looks like a very unreasonable high target to set. But of course, if you look at the global trends and the way institutions within the region, Cape Town, Pretoria, Stellenbosch, Wits, Makerere, are getting hooked into global networks, it's possible to do that. when it comes to graduate training, we believe strongly it's possible to increase by over 500% the number of PhDs that are being trained within a matter of a decade, largely working through various innovative ways of doing PhD training. And we put a lot of emphasis on split-site PhD programs. Research management is another area that we attach a lot of importance. The reason being that many African universities have difficulty attracting grants to their institutions because they don't show enough capacity to manage resources properly. So how do we change that? And then research advocacy, basically over here, the argument we make is that African governments don't put enough into research because they can't value the research that is coming out, and they don't do that because we don't make enough of a case for it. How do we use our research as advocacy tools to excite governments and encourage them to put more and more into research? So research uptake is something that is major to all that we are trying to do over here. So these are the 16 universities that have come together to do. There are 6 from South Africa, Stellenbosch, Pretoria, Wits, KwaZulu-Natal, Rhodes, and then Cape Town. And then outside of South Africa, we have another group, 9 of them, Nairobi, Makerere, Addis Ababa, Rwanda, Lagos, Ibadan, Ghana, Sheikh Anta Diop, Dar es Salaam, and then Obafemi Awolowo, also in Nigeria. So these are the 16 member universities for Arua. Now, we talk about using this network to change the landscape. We want to provide an incentive for all universities in the region to see Arua not simply as an elitist group, but as a part of a chain that is open to everybody. So we've created criteria that do not pay as much attention to output as they do on the process. So the criteria emphasize improvements that are taking place in the environment in which universities operate. So we talk about various questions that universities must answer in order to be eligible. Does the university strategic plan highlight adequately the significance of research and graduate training? Are we happy with the approach that the university is taking? Does the plan provide a clear and acceptable strategy for generating more high-quality research and graduate training? Has there been a steady and acceptable growth of the research budget? If a university intends to make research a major pillar in its programs, it should be reflected in how much it spends on research. Until about 10 years ago, the University of Ghana did not have zero allocation for research. Everything that was generated at the university was for teaching. So obviously, you can't do anything if you yourself are not going to put any money into it. Every research that was done there was paid for by somebody from outside, every single research. 10 years ago, we made the conscious decision to invest some of the university's internally generated funds into the research program by giving grants to early career researchers, and it made a very big difference. Do we see signs of this in many other places, which sometimes we want to encourage? Have there been steady improvements in research output over the preceding 5 years? So if a university wants to be part of this network, do we see evidence that there's a steady improvement? Of course, that calls for someone to be gathering the data. So we are investing quite a bit in developing benchmark data that is being used to assess universities. And the throughput of graduates improving over time. Until about 5 years ago, for many PhD programs in a number of West African universities, it took between 6-7 years to graduate. And many of those who start and not complete. For many master's programs, the completion rate was well under 30%. Of course, you find similar things in many other places, but many African universities can't afford that, and that's something that we need to work on. Then the second set of issues that we were interested in is whether nationally, the research environment was changing. Is the government interested and supportive of the research focusing of universities that were focused on research? Are governments interested? If governments are not interested, it's going to be extremely difficult to do any of this. So you will find, I mean, last week 2 weeks ago, I was in Uganda, and I learned that the national government has decided to increase the research budget of Makerere by $20 million. It's the first, outside of South Africa, it's the first time I've seen any African government do that. So that kind of change clearly supports what we want to do. So it's not surprising that Makerere is, outside of South Africa, the highest ranked African university. You go to Rwanda, the university's budget was doubled in a year. That was 2 years ago. The university budget was doubled and something put in there for research. How do you get this message across all of Africa that if governments want to see improvements, they got to show their support for research? Does the university have enough autonomy to pursue any research? Unfortunately, in many African countries, while governments may be willing to put a bit of money into the research and so on, they take academic freedom and the autonomy of universities a lot more with a pinch of salt. Very few countries in Africa want to see a very free expressing a university where academics do exactly what they want, and sometimes they confuse accountability with academic freedom. They believe that once they give you $1, you must account for it, which is right. You must account for it, but that dollar should not determine what you can say and how you say it. And many African governments have difficulty with that. So part of what we do with this network is encourage African researchers to be as expressive as they can be without selling their freedom for any thing that may be gained elsewhere. Now, of course, we also talk about partnerships. Does the university that wants to be a part of this show enough interest in inter-university arrangements? It's something that we attach a lot of importance to. Many universities today have an international programs office. To what extent do they encourage students from other African countries to come to their own university? Are they willing to send their students to other places? So that's a major part of what we consider in terms of whether we should admit a university or not. So I give this example from the University of Ghana in terms of a university being able to show that it is interested and committed to being a research university. It takes time. So in 2007, the University of Ghana invited a visitation panel to come and discuss what was wrong with the university. As a result of many of the recommendations that they made, university began to allocate what we call IGF, internally generated funds, to support faculty research. They started giving grants of about $30,000 to researchers from its own allocation. There was a recommendation made in 2009 for the creation of an office that would manage research at the university. By 2010, this office was created. 2011, the university began to develop a policy for research. And in 2012, it set up a whole new office with a deputy vice chancellor, and then began recruiting what we call the research development officers to run. So over a period, a 5-year period, the university was able to change its whole approach to the way research was organized within it. And that made a very big difference to what it is today. Of course, so as I said, the ARUA uses a number of strategies to achieve, all of this is driven by the need for collaboration. ARUA has identified 13 areas that it wants to see as a priority in terms of making a difference to the countries that they operate in. And these 13 have been selected largely for the significance that they have for the attainment of the SDGs. Apart from that, we will develop a database of all researchers in the key priority areas, and then using this to create 13 centers of excellence. So those 13 centers of excellence are what we emphasize now. So for the natural sciences, working a lot in the area of climate change, and the non-communicable diseases, food security, renewable energy, materials development, and nanotechnology, and the water conservation. For the social sciences, humanities, we focus on poverty and inequality, unemployment and skills development, urbanization and habitable cities, good governance, notions of identity, post-conflict societies, and then migration and mobility. So these are the 13 areas that we are working in. What we've done is encourage our universities that I showed you earlier to host one or two of these centers of excellence. We decided deliberately not to let anyone host more than two, largely because we didn't want the South African universities to more or less dominate the entire arrangement. So climate change, for example, is hosted at Cape Town, NCDs at University of Nairobi, food security is done at Pretoria, renewable energy is done at Stellenbosch, materials development and nanotechnology at WITS, and then water conservation at Rhodes University. And then poverty and inequality is dealt with, again, at UCT, unemployment at Lagos, urbanization also at Lagos, good governance at Addis Ababa, notions of identity at Makerere, post-conflict also at Addis Ababa, and then migration mobility at WITS. So that's the way these have been structured. What it means is that if we're running a PhD program on climate change, they will gather around the center at UCT. It would mean that all 16 universities will work together on this climate change program to ensure that the students that are doing it have the best forms of support, both from within and also from outside. Hopefully, through that, we'll be able, within a short period, produce about 500 PhDs in climate change for different countries. That's the way it's structured. So for these centers of excellence, we've just received our first large grant from the UKRI. UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation, 20 million pounds. Each of them receives £200,000 a year for 3 years, and it's renewable. And then 6 of them will get £2 million for their research for 3 years. The challenge for us is how to sustain this going forward. How do we, so of course, writing grant applications has become the focus of all of this. But what is important is that we don't use these grants only for the benefit of the hosted institution. The grants are supposed to be used to develop a node that attracts researchers not only from the Arua University, but also from the entire region. So for each center of excellence, you will find people from not only Arua universities, but also the other universities. So a good example is the migration center that we have at WITS. It has a program that includes researchers from Zimbabwe and from Botswana, even though they are not part of the network itself. So in changing the research landscape for the region, the idea here is to use whatever resources we have to pull up all the other universities in the region. So we expect the University of Ghana in Ghana, for example, to be a hub for bringing up Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, the Cape Coast, and all the other UDAs and so on. That's the philosophy behind the Arua experience that we have over here. And as a result of this, being able to work strongly with other universities, we'll be able to move forward much faster. As a result of what the grants we have from UKRI, the split-site PhDs are going to be a major part of what we are doing. Each grant requires the receiving university to work with a UK university. And that's how we expect the capacity building to be done in terms of an exchange program that has both a northern side as well as a southern side. So this is what we've seen in terms of changes taking place. We conclude by saying that research universities can make a difference to African development. Without them, the likelihood that the region will be able to achieve its goals and ambitions under the SDGs will be very, very difficult. Africa is poised, Arua is poised to change, to make a change to the higher education landscape in Africa, and is keen to work with the best universities, both in the region and outside of the region, to make this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. Maybe, would you like to sit down, or we ask a few questions or make comments? The recipe for advancing science in Africa is free-flowing interaction between universities and teachers, and technology playing a role. That's all very convincing. I liked your list of themes because maybe half of them are also CEF themes. I probably, as others in the room, quickly counted to whom we connect from these 16 universities, and I came to meaningful cooperations between CEF and 8 of them. Probably I underestimated. So I think we are nicely positioned. And as one university expands its work on development and sustainability and lots of other topics under its excellence, transdisciplinary research areas, I hope we will find connections that are bigger than what we do so far. Now you have had time while I was filling a gap until your arms come up. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ernst, for this very fascinating talk, full of ideas and thoughts, and I'm very pleased to have in-depth information about this RUA. I think it's an excellent initiative. I think one should understand that in the 70s and early 80s, the universities in Africa were really very good. And in Accra University, University of Khartoum, Makerere University, the University of Ibadan in Nigeria were among the best universities in the developing world. They were really first-class universities. And what happened was, the economic crisis came. Our political leaders didn't see the difficulty of destroying the universities, because building them is very difficult, destroying them is easy. So they cut the resources for the universities. And that was the beginning of the decline of the universities in Africa. I think it all comes to money. How much is the government paying for the universities and for the higher education in general? So unfortunately, we are in this situation, and this initiative, I think, is helping quite a lot. One thing I really liked in your priorities, and that is the awareness, the advocacy, you call it. And the advocacy, I think, is so important for the majority of African countries. And I'm really thinking about having Arua taking that role in a very strong manner, in the sense that why don't, for example, Arua try to design what I may call awareness workshops, going to several countries and try to at least meet with the policymakers and show them how important building research universities, and not just the research universities as such, but quality research universities. I think the word quality is very important. In fact, I think every African country should really aim at least having one quality research university, at least one. So that advocacy I think it's very important, very essential. So the research advocacy related to the awareness workshops, I think can benefit quite a lot. The centers of excellence, it's an excellent idea, because you don't have the resources to build all the universities. But if you build pockets of excellence within universities, I think that will move the agenda forward. I'm not sure whether you know the initiative of the World Bank, the African Centers of Excellence. This is something rather similar to what you've described here, but it is an agreement between the World Bank and specific countries in Africa. And the money is actually coming from the African governments that agreed to this partnership with the World Bank. So that's a good example how African governments are now beginning to feel that it's important for them to finance higher education. They support centers of excellence through competitive program. They select the best, but they give them a lot of money. The successful university gets about $8 million to build its postgraduate training program, but not nationally, but regionally, in a specific area that is selected, whether it is climate change, whether it is energy, whether it is agriculture, in selected areas, but it is the agreement with the government of a certain African country. And so that is a commitment that I would really like to see all African countries doing it.
This was quite elaborate. Maybe, Ernest, you respond right away.
Okay. No, I think I agree with almost everything that Ahmed has said. The fact that the universities used to be good is something that cannot be denied. They used to be good, whether it's Makerere, Nairobi, Khartoum, Addis Ababa, they used to be very good. The decline began earlier for some of them than it did for others. The University of Ghana saw its decline in the mid-70s with the brain drain. Most Ghanaian lecturers or professors from the university left for Nigeria or for Southern Africa and so on. So the decline began at that time. For other universities, it began a lot later. Many of the Nigerian universities declined a lot later. So why has it taken them so long to rebuild? For a fact, many of them didn't even accept that they had a problem. For a long time, they had been used to the state providing resources for them. And when the state began to face its own challenges in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I was no longer able to, they themselves had lost the energy to look outside. The difference between then and now is the fact that you have university leaders that recognize that you don't need to rely on the state 100% for the resources to run a university. That you can do some things yourself. And that new awareness is what is fostering this kind of change. But it varies across the region. In the Francophone countries, for example, they haven't managed to free themselves from the state. So the state dictates what happens. The hiring of faculty, the engagement of researchers, how much money is spent, it's all determined by. So in those places, universities are run like the civil service. And that is a major part. The freedom that academics need to run universities properly is not there. So where you find more freedom given, where you find people being innovative in finding resources, the universities are coming back to life. 10 years ago, most of the international students that we had at the University of Ghana doing medicine, biochemistry, and so on, came from Nigeria, because the Nigerian universities were in a free fall. 5 years ago, they decided to fix the problem. They've improved significantly in places like Ibadan, in Lagos, in the north, in the Bayero, in the east, places like Nsukka. They've improved a lot. What it means is that the University of Ghana has lost a major source of revenue. has lost a major source of revenue. You go to Makerere, it's the same thing, where they actually large numbers of Kenyan students, large numbers of Rwandan students. So Makerere had a very good revenue base from Rwanda, from Kenya, from Burundi, and so on. That is changing. As Nairobi has improved, as Rwanda is building a strong university, that source. So it forces university management to think about other ways in which they can use resources more efficiently. And that, for me, is a major thing that's happening. You talk about advocacy being important. Yes, I agree with you. And that we need to find innovative ways of reaching governments, governments at different levels, at the highest national level. And also. But we're also talking to the African Union. The idea is that to get the African Union to put pressure on national governments to spend more on research and on graduate training. Once they do that, it will become easier for governments to do that. We are working with the what we call the Science Granting Council's initiative to make sure that in every country, the government sets up the infrastructure for supporting scientific research, modeled on the NRF in South Africa, the National Research Foundation in South Africa. Quite recently, Kenya set up its own NRF, modeled on the one of the South Africa. We expect to see a similar thing in Ghana, in Nigeria, before the end of the year. So with these councils coming on board, hopefully we will see many African governments begin to work closely with researchers, with universities. The ACE example you give is good. What we have tried to do is to convince the World Bank that you can work with us. And we, as a result of the commitment being made by the universities themselves, for each of the centers of excellence that I mentioned, the university hosting it commits $50,000 of its own money every year to the center. It's not paying the salaries of the staff, no. It's for the research itself and for supporting graduate students. In return, the UKRI grant gives each one of them £200,000. So there's no better way of expressing the commitment of African universities than watching them pay $50,000 every year to a center of excellence. And I will say to the World Bank, if you are looking for more commitment, but as well work with us, we can do for you 5 times better what you are doing with the ACE. If we got the money that the World Bank was spending on the ACEs, at least another 50 centers of excellence can be created in well-established universities, universities that already have a track record of excellence, that are linked to other universities. If I have difficulty with some of the selection that I've seen done for the World Bank ACEs, the universities have no track record when it comes to research, and yet I've received $8 million. That's a problem that needs to be resolved. So I agree with you entirely, but we can finesse what is being done and lead to better results.
Let me ask a number of people to make their points, and maybe you can take some notes. Certainly money matters. There is practically no area I can think of where the gap between rich world and poor world is bigger than science spending. You can roughly estimate it's maybe $1,500 per capita in Europe, and in most parts of Africa it's $50 per capita per year. So 1 to 300. Let it be 1 to 100. So it's huge, a huge gap. Bina, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for raising so many interesting issues. So I had, I very much like the idea of regional cooperation, Arua, and the examples you gave, for instance, that some countries are able to put in more money. The example of roads, for instance, that you have equipment the surplus capacity, and then you can collaborate. But I was wondering if there was a difference between science and social science, because still to some extent people see science as ideologically neutral. But when it comes to social science, I wonder if it would be that easy, because then suppose you have political science and you're talking about ideas of democracy or institutions, then different countries would have quite different views about how much freedom they would allow through this collaboration of ideas which may be critical of their regions. So embedded in collaboration is also a potential conflict, which could come up if you're talking about social science ideas. It seems to me, so I wanted your response on that. The second is, there is an issue which keeps coming up in the Indian context, for instance, that, it's the thing about what is happening to our schooling. What kinds of students are we producing? Because those are the ones that are going to go into higher education. And the most critical issue which comes up is, are we teaching them critical thinking? Because research is the creation of knowledge by questioning prior knowledge and then creating something new. So what do you see? Do you see that also as a challenge in Africa? That your schools are not producing the kinds of people who would then produce excellence in research at the higher education level. And that's not a question of money really alone. I mean, there is money, but one of the things that's happening in India is huge amounts of money is given to research scholars. You can't actually afford to hire people anymore. But my understanding is that many of them shouldn't be in research at all. But they are in research because the government feel that if they give higher scholarships, they're going to produce some peer reviews, excellent journals. They're not. So how do you see this gap between education and at the school level and this? And the third is just a question, because you would have looked at it, and I'm sure Joachim and others, that where is China on this? And again, is there a difference between when we talk about Chinese institutions and universities being in the top ranking? Is it because of their science, but is it also because of their social science or not? Because social science then again requires you to question things which you may not, the Chinese government may not want them to question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Ernest.
Sign of hand, who all wants to talk? I've seen one here, one there, and then we give you the final word, Ernest, and we can continue when walking out, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Ernest. Very nice talk. Like Bina, I have a couple of questions. One is, you rightly mentioned that these research-intensive universities are very expensive, very capital-intensive. Expanding on a little bit on what Mohammed said, if you go even further back in time, say the 1940s and 50s, you had universities like Makerere, Dar es Salaam, Ibarra, Dakar, that were serving the region. And the political and intellectual leadership of Africa in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they all went to these universities. Isn't there a need to come back to a regional approach? That would be my first question. Second, you also mentioned Egypt and Egyptian universities in your talk. I'm surprised that there's not an Egyptian university in Arua. Third, you, with very good reason, lament about the lack of employability of many of the graduates. What's Arua's approach to improve employability of graduates? The priority areas, I did also a rough calculation. I think except for one in the natural sciences, they were all allocated to South African universities, and even in the social science, there were quite a number that were allotted to South African universities. Doesn't this cement a little bit this kind of tilted relationship of universities in Africa and universities in South Africa? And last question, can you say something about links between Arua and the Academy of Sciences in Africa? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, please hand it here and then there, and then we call it an evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was thinking about the millions of and underemployed academics in Africa. Nigeria, Ethiopia are some examples, and I mean, you were saying it's not a question of money only. Of course, there is a need of money, but it's not the question only. It's also a question of teaching methods, on curricula development, which and it's not only the development of or new buildings or the establishment of new buildings, as we have seen in Ethiopia, for example. The country is now full of new universities in Ethiopia. In the smallest cities, there's new universities, but they are literally empty, and the quality is very low. Yeah, and the graduates of these universities, in their thousands and even millions, are on the streets later on, and this contributes to unrest, to social unrest, as we have seen in Ethiopia. I mean, many of these demonstrators were unemployed academics. Yeah, so how do you deal with that, or how?
Thank you. I think that the share of private funding is rising throughout the world for universities. How do you think this is going to play out, the private funding in Africa?
Thank you. Ernest, step up to the challenge, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bina's question about whether there's a difference between the way the sciences are treated and then the social sciences, and how it plays out. It's a very important question in the sense that it goes well beyond how governments look at it to how even universities in the allocation of resources manage this. When Arua started, about half of the vice-chancellors came from a health science background. Another third came from the other natural sciences. There were only 2 of us that had a social science background. So most of the issues that they were interested in were largely to do with the natural sciences. It took a lot of effort to get them to understand that the best way to handle many of these things is through interdisciplinary approaches. So out of that discussion, we agreed that even for the science, we would do everything in an interdisciplinary manner. So for each of our centers of excellence, whether it's climate change, materials development, non-communicable diseases, we provide for scientists and non-scientists to work together. That's the approach. It's a way of building in each university a new orientation in terms of how the sciences and the non-sciences work together. And so you raise the issue of how governments will relate to this dichotomy, let me put it that way. 2 weeks ago in Makerere, we had a public lecture, the first Arua public lecture, which was delivered by Professor Yango, talking about identity. It was very obvious that the views taken by the lecturer and also the social scientists at Makerere was completely at odds with the view of the national government, in fact, or the president. And so it was bound to provide some sort of conflict. We took the position that Arua, being an international body, would provide some kind of protection to local academics so they'd be able to speak out freely on issues. So while many African academics are afraid of being branded in their own countries for whatever opinions they have on whether on sexuality or whatever, religion and so on, that they will be able to find protection in larger numbers that go outside of their own country. So that's the approach that we are using. How do you protect national academics from local politics? And if a larger body like Aurora cannot do it, it will be extremely difficult for the local institutions to do it. But that's the way we look at it. Your second question was about the decline in the quality of school leavers and how these feed. It's a very widespread problem in Africa. Many of the people that are entering universities for undergraduate programs have come from very challenged backgrounds. It comes from a school system that has been extremely politicized. So spending on schools is not done in a way to derive as much improvement as possible, but more how do we as governments get to be seen as being, so populism is what is driving most of our policies on education in Africa. So we talk about that, and we're trying to put pressure on governments to put aside the populist approach to education. I always say in Ghana, in the last 1.5 decades, every single reform that has been introduced into education has been done to appease one group or the other, whether they are teachers, whether they are students, whether they are parents, whether they are politicians. Every single reform has been done because one group is demanding it. So there isn't a broader look at what do we want to achieve with school reforms. It's more about how do we keep this group quiet. So teachers want to have more time to pursue master's degrees. So we change the school term, the dates for the school term. Parents are complaining about fees, so you fix the fees for all schools. Kids don't like the school uniforms, so you change. So as soon as one group, for whatever reason, complains, and you think it's a sizable enough group, and you want to keep them quiet, you do for them what they want. So and we've got to fight these things, and Aurora provides a platform for campaigning against this kind of thing. Where is China in all of this? Interestingly, for a long time, China didn't really feature much in higher education matters in various African countries. The earliest that we got in terms of acquaintance with the Chinese system was with the Confucius Institute. So in most universities, you find a Confucius Center being opened over there. So that's, and now increasingly you get Chinese being taught, offered as a program in many universities in the region. Of course, also we find Chinese influence coming in terms of infrastructure development. If you go to Nairobi University today, University of Nairobi, a lot of new infrastructure has come up in the last 5 years, most of it financed from China. Similar thing you find in Makerere. So there is a growing presence of China in the Africa. How does it affect the programs? I don't think much thinking has gone into that yet. I don't think the Confucius Center in any university has a strong enough link to the other programs of the university. Maybe that's going to come later. So we don't have a situation where there's an interest in science as opposed to the social sciences that has not emerged yet. Will it come? It's something that probably needs to be anticipated and probably in a much more structured way dealt with. Christian wants to know whether we need regional universities. I think the time is past. You're not going to get. I mean, there's a lot that has changed. So whereas a university like University of Ghana could serve as a hub for most of Anglophone West Africa outside of Nigeria, today Sierra Leone has its own university, Gambia has its own university, Liberia has its own university. So the likelihood that you serve as a hub for all of these is extremely low. Nationalism in university development is quite rife in the region. That's why Prof. Kagame in Rwanda has all of a sudden realized that rankings of universities are important, and they do speak well of a nation. And so he wants to see his university become the highest ranked in East Africa. These forms of nationalism with higher education lead to some interesting decisions being made by governments. So the likelihood that other countries will sit down and say, oh, I mean, take Burundi and Rwanda as examples. So Rwanda has a rapidly growing university. Burundi is struggling, even though I know many better Burundian academics than Rwandan. Rwanda is spending far more on this university than Burundi is doing. What's going to happen is that many of the good Burundian academics, if they do get a chance, will move to Rwanda. So it's these kinds of things that would make it unlikely that universities would emerge as regional universities. What they can do, the existing ones, as they fix their problems, through internationalization, they are able to attract students from the region, as Makerere does for East Africa, as Ibadan is doing, as the University of Ghana was doing. So it's the internationalization programs that they have that will serve as the incentive for drawing academics, for drawing. I don't know if you remember that in the 60s and 70s, many African social scientists were drawn to the University of Dar es Salaam. They were drawn there largely because the environment was very good for exchanges, that, Dar es Salaam was the place to be. Very radical ideas were to be tested and so on. Today, it is very difficult to do that kind of thing anywhere in Africa. So how do we position the African university to serve as a new hub for new ideas? Hopefully, through our centers of excellence, we'll see that emerging. You were surprised that there are no Egyptian universities in Nairobi. That's true. That's very much something that we regret. It's not for lack of interest. We decided very early that Aruba should not go past 25 members, modeled on the Russell Group approach that you have in the UK. So 25, we said we were going to look for 4 universities that did fit into the, or met the criteria that I shared with you. And we will look for universities in Egypt, in Morocco, and in Tunisia, and another Francophone West African university. So we get our 20. And then the university will have to compete for the last 5 slots. We've tried very hard to find Egyptian universities, Moroccan, and we haven't been successful for many different reasons. Well, it's more of a speculation as to why they don't show that interest. But we are certainly very interested in having Egyptian universities as part of our network. There is an issue of the employability of the graduates, which is very similar to what you have. Yeah. You have graduates completing degrees in the programs in pharmacy and not finding jobs. How do you deal with it? It's a two-way thing. There are many who like to blame the universities for the kind of programs that they run, not preparing them for the world of work. That's the phrase often used to describe what you do. We don't prepare young people for the world of work. I'm not sure it's a fair assessment of the situation, because in many of the economies that have failed to provide an opportunity for these people, the work itself is not there. You have economies that are growing fairly rapidly in some cases, but no structural change taking place in them. So the example I gave you of nursing, and I can give you examples of civil engineering, structural engineering, and so on. So you come to a place like Ghana, there's a lot of infrastructure development. And so you imagine that all the civil engineers will be very busy. They'll be very, very busy. But the way technology is employed in the construction industry is such that you can do a lot of those things without the civil engineer that you've trained, which allows other technicians who may not have a degree in civil engineering or structural engineering to be involved. So you can design buildings with architects. Arua is going to have in November a conference in Nairobi on the Africa and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, redefining the role of universities. If today we are able to put up 20-story buildings without using your traditional architects and structural engineers, what would it mean for those disciplines in another 10, 20 years? It's something that we need to think about. So the unemployability, the unemployment of graduates is something that, yes, the universities can take responsibility for part of the problem, but the other part is well beyond the universities. And so we've got to have a dialogue on how to deal with it, as opposed to blaming each other. That's where I think, and Arua is playing a role in here. We would like to engage governments for them to understand that it's a bigger problem than they anticipate, and universities alone cannot solve that problem. When the issue of private funding arises, what would that mean for universities? It depends on how the private funds are channeled into the universities. You find a lot of private support for research and for graduate work in the US. The US is a good example of where private money plays a major role. We don't have that much so most of the non-public funds coming into Africa today will be fees that are paid by students. One of the things Arua is trying to do is to encourage African philanthropists to spend more on education. There are many fairly rich Africans who are happy to support universities in the US. They give to American university endowments fairly generously in expectation of a good honorary degree or something else, something similar. We haven't learned how to do that yet properly in Africa. And we are looking for ways in which the rich Nigerians, rich South Africans, rich Kenyans, rich Ghanaians can be brought on board in order to increase. But of course, it has to be properly organized in order that they do not dictate what universities use monies for. So that's the approach that we are using. Thank you.
Well, you give us an idea there to attract rich African funding. For CEF, we would happily rename, Christian, this lecture hall into the Dangote lecture hall for 50 million, or something like that. Ernest, I'm sure our colleagues share your enthusiasm. Something very special is happening with science in Africa. I felt that, especially at the last two Next Einstein Forum events in Africa, the largest science community meetings with more than 1,000, mostly young scientists coming together, also sharing the belief that next Einstein, she will be from Africa. I have seen these youngsters at these AMIS centers on mathematics and basic science education for bright young Africans, for instance, in Dakar, Senegal, and in Kigali, Rwanda. What convinced me that they would not end up unemployed was that they all had an entrepreneurial spirit. They wanted to convert their science into action, and they wouldn't shy away from creating their own business. So maybe that is the solution with the research universities, not looking to government job, but to their own jobs. What does this all mean for CEF? A lot. Let me say we have just recently signed a $300,000 contract with AERC, the African Economic Research Consortium, to partner in their master and PhD programs in areas of research. And another anecdote with which I close is we work with Sheikh Anta Diop University, the old Francophone one in Dakar, and did with them, or they with us, call for papers on climate change economics for a conference. And we got more, I think, than 150, Alicia, you managed that, more than 150 applications so far for slots, competitive papers at that conference, which we hold later in November in Dakar with Sheikh Anta Diop. That would be impossible 10 years ago, to get from the West African region so many young scientists competing for a slot in a conference on climate change economics. So that's a payoff from the Vascal program, partly, which was related to CEF. Ernest, thank you so much for your stimulating talk, and please connect us, help us to connect Bonn University, German universities, and CEF to this wonderful network which you have masterminded. Thank you very much.